Our 24th session of the ASF Connect video conference. This is a program that we started 2 years ago when COVID broke out, and we are so honored today to have with us two preeminent leaders of our time, a Swiss and an American, of course. Professor John Hennessy, the former president of Stanford and chairman of Alphabet, which, as you know, is the parent company of Google, and Professor Joël Mesot, the president of ETH Zurich. Before we start the program, let me welcome a few special guests who are with us today. We have two ambassadors from Switzerland and the United States in the audience, Ambassador Jacques Pitlou in Washington and Marcus Berlin in New York. Thank you for joining us, and thank you for all the wonderful support you provide to the American Swiss Foundation. I'd also like to thank the members of the American Swiss Foundation's board and Swiss Advisory Council who are in the audience. You make possible all of our programs, so thank you for being here and supporting us. I learned recently that Professor Hennessy spoke at ETH 4 years ago on Silicon Valley innovation. And a year later, I had the honor of visiting Stanford with our Silicon Valley Tech Tour, and Professor Hennessy gave a wonderful fireside chat with our chairman, Bob Giffra. Last year, he nominated a young man named Khalil Fuller to be a participant in the historic Young Leaders Conference that took place in November in Switzerland, just between the Delta and the Omicron virus. And we were so fortunate to spend a week with Khalil, who is an entrepreneur and a real leader of our country. He has already started multiple companies and now runs a venture studio where he coaches future entrepreneurs, other entrepreneurs, to lead new companies. And I'm so happy to see that we have at least 7 of Khalil's classmates of the Young Leaders class of 2021 on the call. So thank you for being here. During the Young Leaders Conference, we visited ETH and had a chance to meet President Mesot and some of your talented students who presented their projects. And then in January, I met Professor Mesot again in New York, and we talked about the importance of US-Swiss collaboration in academia and in technology and innovation. So I thought it would be wonderful to host a conversation with these two amazing leaders about how they see innovation unfolding in post-COVID times. To do our speakers justice, it would take 10 minutes to introduce each of them. And the list of their accomplishments is so long. And I will resist the temptation to do that and ask you perhaps to Google them, pun intended. And of course, even that is not necessary because we will just hear them speak, and that's what we're here for. So I really appreciate your time, your presence today, Professor Hennessy, Professor Mesot. And without further ado, I'd like to hand it over to Khalil, noting that you in the audience are able to put questions in the Q&A chat. And Khalil will decide when to take them and which ones to take. But do put them in, please. We look forward to hearing your questions. And with that, Khalil, over to you.
Wonderful. Yeah, Patricia, well, thank you so much for having me and for the opportunity to be here today. Professors Hennessy and Mesot, it's really quite an honor to be facilitating this conversation, and I will kind of fade away as much as possible and really just let you two run with it. But I do want to start, I think, on behalf of all of us in just expressing our deep sadness and at what's going on in Ukraine right now, and our solidarity with the Ukrainian people. I know is something that we're all feeling today. And maybe starting there, I'd love for each of you to maybe just share a bit about what have the last 10 days looked like for you? What are the leadership decisions you've had to make? Who are the folks that you've had to counsel, and just kind of bring us into your world of leadership in this last week? And maybe Professor Hennessy, we'll start with you.
Thank you, Khalil. Well, I think it has been a difficult time. We obviously have some students from the Ukraine, as well as some students that still have family in Russia and other parts of Eastern Europe. So it's been difficult for them, and we're trying to provide appropriate support for them as they go through this era. It's also been an interesting time for the tech companies, as well as we've tried to navigate What do we do about fake news that's being used in Russia, for example? How do we sustain accurate news and accurate information in Ukraine, particularly in light of a lot of cyber warfare that's being launched against various internet sites in the Ukraine. So navigating that in an appropriate way, and you probably saw that all the major tech companies have put a halt on advertising revenue going to Russia. And the goal here is simply to not allow that additional source of revenue to be used to power the war. But it's difficult. Things are moving very fast, and that requires a level of consultation. And one of the difficult things you have in this, particularly for the tech companies, is how do you reduce possible harms without creating other harms, without creating unintended side effects in this situation. For example, I'll give you a simple example. There are many Ukrainians who feel that the Russian population does not have accurate access to information about what their leaders are doing in the Ukraine. How do you get that kind of information out in a country that still has censorship and control over all sources of information, whether it be press or online internet? So challenging times, I think.
So yes, I confirm also, this is unbelievable what's happening actually. The ambassador of Switzerland to Ukraine, that turns out I know him very well because we were in school together, also primary school, and made a very strong statement. He said, we never learn. And we thought in Europe we would not go into this kind of situation again. So for me, it's there are 4 levels at which we are involved. And personally, I just want to mention, I was in Ukraine 2 years ago with the visit of our president of the Swiss Confederation, Mrs. Sommaruga, because we produced our respirators for the world, the cheap respirators that we produced, that we developed at ETH, was produced in Ukraine for COVID. And so we visited that, and I was lucky to go, let's say lucky, I don't know, I was a part of the delegation that went to the border, conflict border to Donbass, and we could see already there the tension that there was. And it's very sad that in all these years, we were not able to find a solution. So these 4 levels are first the institutional level, and here we position the ETH very clearly. We made a strong statement because, as you, John, we have a quite significant Ukrainian community at ETH. It was about 40 individuals. And then we needed really to show a strong sign also of solidarity. And then there is the second level, which is the expertise that we have at ETH to advise our government. It turns out we have a center that is called the Center for Security Studies. And it's not very visible, but when you have this crisis situation, suddenly it becomes very visible. So these experts are in the news every day, advising, explaining what's happening, explaining to the population. I think it's a very important role. And then there are the level of our researchers and professors. There is a huge wave of immigration coming to through Poland to other countries, and they are coming now. So we need to take care of them. Switzerland took a very big step, well, 2 steps actually. One, it's not very often that Switzerland is applying very strict measures against Russia in that case. That's kind of a shift in our policy. And the second, we have a new kind of visa permit to protect the people so they can enter without any request to Switzerland. and they will be able to work and also to study if they want to continue their studies. And this is where, again, we come into the game. So we open we made a call, and the response from our faculties is just amazing. And then there is the last level, which is the personal level. Because we are so close, imagine it's 3 hours from Switzerland, from Zurich, right? So there is an organization ongoing of goods that are transported to, all kinds of goods that are now missing to Ukraine. And I must say, I talked yesterday evening to the Ukrainian community at ETH, and they are so courageous, so resilient, and they are already organized. And so I asked, what can we do more to help you? And there were a few points we were discussing. So very intense since last week. And it was really, nobody believed that a week ago or 10 days ago that it could come to this situation.
Yeah, certainly. I think the world is in awe of the strength of the Ukrainian people, as certainly. Thank you both for that. And so now, I guess, kind of coming to the headline topic of the conversation, fostering innovation, right? It's a very broad question, but I'd love to just maybe dig into how each of you think about fostering innovation, creating the right environment for innovation to take root across the institutions that you're a part of. Maybe John, going back to you.
Well, I think it's a great question, Khalil. I think innovation begins with invention. It begins with creation of new knowledge and new insights. And I think particularly when I think about innovations and eventually often companies that have reset the landscape, that formed not just a single entity, but really led the creation of a new industry, right? Cisco's creation of the internet and the networking industry, right? Obviously, the social media companies that created that industry, the database in a company like Oracle, and many of those roots begin with discoveries and inventions in the universities, and I think that's a key role that we play, particularly I think, as some of the large central long-term research laboratories have faded, the Bell Labs of the world that have faded in terms of their role that they play. Now, we've got some new ones cropping up with Google and Microsoft and Amazon making very large investments in new technologies. But universities are the beginning of that. I think the other piece we've seen that's vitally important is some amount of preparation and education of our students. I many years ago when I was a dean of engineering, I said, look, it's very simple. I don't want one of our students that has a really great idea to go out, engage with the venture community, but not have the knowledge to engage in an equitable and fair way, so that they're at an information disadvantage. So I think a lot of the things we did in building up the Technology Ventures program over time and building up curriculum has really been about preparing our students to be more successful, whether they're entrepreneurs or intrapreneurs, because the same pitch happens inside a company. You have a great new idea, you want to make a product, you still have to convince management that it's a good business and it's a good opportunity. So those are things that I think are critical to keep that innovation engine going as we go forward.
So John has said most of what I wanted to say, but so let me get some examples. Of course, Stanford is for us an example. We lag a little bit behind, but I think we have developed quite well in Switzerland, ETH, and I mentioned also the two ETH schools, also EPFL and ETH. And it's interesting that you mentioned the fundamentals, because I just developed the strategy for the next years, and I added this pillar, the fundamentals. And then everyone told me, yeah, but this is what we do. I said, yes, but nobody knows about it. Yeah. and in a country even with less, let's say, we only have our brains in Switzerland, maybe water and snow, but that's not very useful. And so we need to work and to be at the edge on the technological aspect, not only on the technological aspect. Maybe I say a few words about this at the end. There is a fifth pillar that I added. So we have this three technological pillar that we defined, that it's typical medical, digital, environmental, then the fundamentals, and then the fifth pillar I would mention. Then we need to give always examples. Where is the research coming? Where is the application that we see, let's say in our hospitals? And one where we were very much involved at ETH is MRI. Every hospital has an MRI now. And it turns out it's 60, 70 years of research development, starting from very fundamental particle physics research, who has led to this amazing technology with a few Nobel Prize winners on the way. And just to repeat this again and again, because the politics doesn't understand that aspect. And at the end, a big part of our funding, at least for ETH, comes directly from the state. So we need to repeat that. Then the education part, I think this is essential. If I look back at our students 20 years ago, and they wanted to work for the big, the big traditional companies of Switzerland that are great companies, but now half of them would say, I want to go on the startup scene. I want to create my startup also. So there was a shift in the way they are thinking, and this is because of some examples that they see in the news every week, right? In the past 3 years, there was 1.5 billion Swiss franc that was invested into ETH startups. And 20 years ago, it was almost nothing. So it has really developed well. And this is also because we have put, and my predecessors, of course, a number of tools at the disposal of our students. So that already in the first or second year, if they have an ID, they can have a location, they can have access to 3D printing tools and so on, so they can test and we can support them. As you said, John, we don't abandon them. We just really support them, and some of them lead to startups. Mm-hmm. And so we have a toolbox for this that was developed with 4 or 5 different stages, and the last one being, VC and really let them fly. And yeah, I think now maybe what is more interesting for me is to know what do we need to do for the next steps, because competition is not sleeping, and you might know that Switzerland has put itself in a kind of difficult situation with Europe. I'm not talking about the conflict in Ukraine. I'm talking about our relationship to the European Horizon Europe research program, which gave a big access for our startup to a big market. And suddenly this market is closed. Our startup cannot enter them. Switzerland is a small country, so we need either to be reassociated or to go to other markets, maybe with US or Asia, or to develop new ideas so that we remain competitive. And so we are thinking in these 3 different plan A, B, and C.
Mm-hmm. Maybe we could dig a little bit deeper into the connection and the relationship that universities have or should have with industry. And I'm wondering, maybe even going back to the kind of founding of ETH and back to you, Professor Mesot, and how that relationship has evolved. And I'm wondering if you agree, or if maybe there's a point of disagreement around how closely linked universities should be to not just industry broadly, but also specific companies potentially.
So yes, ETH has been created to modernize Switzerland in 1855, and Switzerland was a very poor country, and so there were some. We just came out of a civil war. I mean, it was not that bad, but it was a religious war, and there were some very bright people who said, okay, let's make a federal university. turns out it was the creation of, it was called Polytechnicum, École Polytechnique at that time, on the French model. And then it became what the ETH is today. And from the beginning, the idea was to have tight links with industry, to create, to electrify Switzerland, to create the bridges. And, some of our famous architects have built bridges all the way to United States and California and San Francisco, and then also tunnels. And so Switzerland became, could modernize. And this has remained. So this tight connection that we have with companies has remained, and we are encouraging our researchers to really start collaborations with companies. This has allowed us also to attract some of the companies to Switzerland. I've seen on the list of guests that are attending that Patrick Warnken is also here, so the head of Google in Switzerland. I believe that Google has come to Switzerland not only because of Switzerland, but also because of ETH. But of course, we need to make the contracts in such a way that the freedom for the research is entirely with the professor, and the companies, they understand that, because if you start to put too strong frame around the researchers, then they won't perform at the end, because you never know where the success will be. And so it's all about educating the brightest people. We shouldn't forget that 80% of our students leave ETH and go to industry directly, and they perform very well. So we talked a lot about research, but at the end, our main mission is the education. Yes. And so what we believe now is that the analysis we make is that the complexity of the issues we need to tackle in all the fields I mentioned before is such that the solutions to these challenges has to be found together with the private industry, because otherwise we might miss some opportunities, we might be too delayed, or the solution is not adequate. And so that's the way we are looking for the future at ETH.
Professor Hennessy, what do you think? Is there a limit to how closely universities should work with industry, or how do you think about that?
Well, certainly, I think Khalil, as Joel said, you really want the faculty directing the research, and you want a level of independence. You want them to pick where they think the best opportunities are. So I think ensuring that that kind of independence exists. There are a lot of advantages of collaboration with industry. I mean, to start, if you really want to understand the problems, you should understand what the state of the art is in industry and what they see as the big hurdles that are often out beyond their time horizon. They're not investing, industry is not usually investing on the kind of time horizon that universities invest in. For us, a technology that goes from, let's say, beginning research program to get out to industry in less than a decade is fairly fast. For industry, a decade is way beyond the horizon they're typically thinking about, with a few exceptions. So I think that they're complementary in my view, right? And symbiotic if they can work together. Joel also mentioned teaching. Same is true for us. Most of our students are going out into industry. One of the things we've noticed is our faculty members that took a leave to participate in a startup and came back to the university are often the very best teachers in the university, because they have something. Many academics who spend their life in the academy never get that exposure. And somebody who's had the exposure has a sense of realism, and how do you think about these things, and how do you think about bringing a product to market that I think really enhances the educational mission as well.
It's interesting. We encourage, we hire also people from industry, and in this year we will start a new program at EPFL and at ETH Zurich with what we call professors of practice. And because also I mean, we can't have an expert in every field desired by industry. So why not get the expertise that exists already in industry back into the school? That would be for short-term they would interact with the students and so on. And we encourage also our students to spend a semester in a company during their studies. Okay, and then there is an aspect I mentioned at the beginning, the fifth pillar. I didn't say what it is, so now I think it's maybe time to say what we observed, and especially during the COVID time, but we knew that before, I'm sure, John. There is an increasing skepticism against technology, especially in part of the population. A part of the population that is growing, and this is becoming really problematic because it's not rational anymore, and so technology alone is not sufficient. We need the acceptance of these technologies, and that's why we define now a new program that is called Dialogue with Society, and it involves more or less 3 levels. You have the society, the population, and really to have a constant dialogue with them. Then there is the highest level, which is directly the politics, be it federal or cantonal in our case, both the parliament and the government. But what is maybe the most important is the administration, because they are those people who produce the laws. And depending on how it's made, it can take a very interesting direction. And when the crisis comes, like the COVID crisis, where we in Switzerland, we had almost no connection, at the highest level on the medical side. We had to establish all this during the crisis, and then it becomes really difficult, because first, they don't speak the same language. Our scientists are not used to be confronted to the different political views. So that was extremely tense, and it's still tense, and so on. So you need to establish this trust well ahead. And so this is what we are, one important part of our program that we are developing now.
Professor Hennessy, going all the way back to the beginning, you mentioned innovation starts with this creativity and starts with the spark that might happen in the lab, and it happens in probably small groups, right? I'd love to learn a little bit about how organizations maintain a culture of innovation as they grow. So you've had a front row seat to see Google from its earliest days to now being one of the largest tech titans in the world. How have they kept that kind of innovative spirit?
It's an interesting question, Khalil. I remember when Eric Schmidt, who was the first CEO of Google, was asked this question, and he said, "We try to behave like Stanford." That was his answer, which means really leaving space. Now, companies have products to produce and customers to support, but leaving space for that innovation. And in the very beginning, Larry and Sergey had a plan where engineers would get to spend some of their time on things that were completely outside their product spectrum. So they'd spend some time on supporting existing products, some time on new innovations within their product space, but sometimes also on doing new things. And 2 of the products that came out of that were Gmail and Google Maps. Both came out of that free time, experimental time. So I think doing some of the things, emulating some of the things that universities do quite naturally, I think is part of the answer to do that, and supporting those and seeing the opportunity. For companies, I think the real challenge is, can you keep a growth mindset? Can you, particularly for organic growth? Acquisition is always another possibility, but organic growth is really what is so hard to maintain as the company grows large. But getting great talent and ensuring that you guard enough of their time that they have time to do new things, I think are what's really worked well for Google over the years.
I think the growth issue is also an issue for the universities. And we especially for ETH, we are funded by the state mainly, so 70-75%. And we have a growth of the state budget that is 1 to 2% per year, and a growth of student that is 4 to 6% since 20 years. So you just make the math and you see we have a problem, right? So, but on the other side, it pushed us to find, to be creative, to find new solutions, to raise more donation and so on. And that's the way we develop. But there are always some limits to this kind of models, things about the overhead issue and so on. And just, you mentioned the Google Map. I have to comment here that part of the technology for the Google Map has come out of some research done at ETH. And there is a long tradition of making super precise maps for the Alps. And started with Dufour, and then it was already linked to some professors at ETH. And so there is a beautiful history, and I like to tell these stories also. It doesn't come out of the nowhere. There is always expertise that has been developed over many years, and that leads to these fantastic discoveries.
Awesome. Reminder to the audience, if you want to ask any questions, put them in the Q&A. We might get to a couple of them in our last 7 minutes or so here. This will be the last question that I asked. That was kind of on my list before. Would love to hear each of you reflect on the importance of kind of relationship building and person-to-person diplomacy, and that happens in programs like the Knight-Hennessy Scholars, like the Young Leaders program that I was really fortunate to participate in, like maybe your Pioneer Fellows at ETH, et cetera. Maybe back to you, John.
Well, education, I mean, we live in a global world. If the pandemic has taught us one thing, it's taught us that no country is an island anymore. It can't possibly be. And I think the tragedy in Ukraine has just reinforced that. So we need to build up education systems which expose students to a more global perspective, give them the opportunity to work with students from different parts of the world. This happens, I think the European universities have done a great job of this. Perhaps it's harder for us because we have a big ocean surrounding us. That makes it a little harder to do it, but we've made progress on it. And I think for us, having that perspective in a group of students that they can share. Many years ago, Stanford actually had many fewer students at the undergraduate level from outside the US. And the provost and I had a conversation and we said, look, when a group of undergraduates gets together, we want somebody sitting at that dinner table to be from outside the US, to have a different perspective. Because if we're going to educate people who are global citizens, they need that perspective. And I think it's vitally important, especially in these times today.
Yes, since John mentioned the European exchange program, so the Erasmus program was created with the idea that if students start to know other countries, make friendships in other countries, maybe the tensions that used to exist in the last centuries between the countries will diminish. By the way, CERN was created with the same idea, to reconcile Germany and France after the Second World War. I was myself involved into an amazing facility that was created in Jordan, a synchrotron. That's with my background, so accelerators, and Syria and Jordan, and then the Palestinian and Israel and Iran, all are members of this facility. So we say when diplomacy and when politics doesn't work anymore, there is still the science. And it was like this during the Cold War. You had American scientists, European scientists going to Russia, developing fantastic ideas together. And so that's one point. And then there is the exposure to a different culture. And so at ETH, we don't recruit faculties that haven't been exposed to a different continent or a different country, a different culture. That's so 60 to 70% of our recruitment is from abroad, and I think it's an essential thing to do. And yeah, maybe in view of the conflict that is happening now, maybe one can revisit and think about what went wrong in this kind of relationships. Maybe something to reflect. Yes.
We have one, maybe our ending question here, a specific one from Dominic Geller says, so tech companies have undertaken multiple efforts to move into digital health with some mixed success. What are the main obstacles you experience, or which ones are still present? Do tech companies have a trust hurdle or perceived conflict of interest to be entrusted with personal health data, or where do we see this going in the future?
So, well, it's accurate that I think there's been a lot less success than we expected. And in the U.S. is a particularly difficult situation because it's not a public health system where the health records are held in some form as it is in many European countries. And that's made it virtually impossible to really get traction at a large enough scale. There are also various issues. For example, just getting Medicare to be a single purchaser for drugs, which would save a phenomenal amount of money. You can't even make this happen because of the balkanized way in which American healthcare is organized. Internationally, I think one of the big problems has been privacy-related issues. And I think the key insight here is it is not enough to just remove a patient's identification, because you can still extract information about patients and put things together which we would regard as an unacceptable situation with respect to somebody's privacy. The good news is there's some fascinating new research going on in various computer science departments around the world to come up with new models of privacy so that we could get to a point where a country with a national health record could use that record to really get key insights on how to improve the health, to develop new drugs, to think about differently about cures and therapies. So I think there's a positive side, and we really need to focus on trying to get to that positive side.
Yes, this is a frustrating situation because we feel the technology has advanced, and on both the medical side, the AI side, and also on the protection of the data privacy side, but it needs some time to convince the population and the authorities that there is little risk. And in Switzerland, we have a special situation because the medical regulation is made by the cantons, so the regions. And each one has a different one. And so it's really difficult to exchange data, even within Switzerland. And the second point is what I said, this kind of, people are becoming skeptical about technologies. And we had a vote, and actually it didn't pass on an electronic ID. And you can imagine, if even for an ID it didn't pass, can you imagine for your medical data what it would be? So there is this need for the dialogue. There is still a long way. In other European countries, it's moving much faster. UK, for example, or northern countries where it's really done at the national level, and here they are moving very fast.
Well, professors, it's been such a treat to hear you both today. I feel like we could go on for hours and hours. Maybe we'll have to do a part 2 one day, but want to be very respectful of your time. And so I'll thank you again, and then pass it back to Patricia.
Thank you, Khalil, and thank you, Professor Hennessy and Professor Mesot, for your wonderful insights at a time where it does feel like we're at a crossroads, and especially with the events unfolding in the Ukraine, reminding us so starkly of the importance to work together to strengthen our shared values, to defend our freedom to do research, our freedom to bring products to market, our freedom to innovate and to collaborate, And it was wonderful to hear your points about what comes out of this cross-fertilization of academia and industry. I loved the example of the Google Maps that I'd heard had been developed in Zurich, but I've never heard the story of the expertise developed at ETH, of the beautiful history of map making. And then, of course, Google took it on to make it what it is today, and we can all find our way around the world thanks to that. So thank you for your time, for showing us a little bit of a roadmap of innovation and collaboration, and for supporting the mission of exchange between America and Switzerland and between the leaders of the two countries that is at the heart of everything we do here at the American Swiss Foundation. With that, I thank you for your support. This concludes our program. Thank you for joining us.